Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today as we're continuing our first unit of economics and personal finance here on Economic Basics, we're going to be talking about incentives. So in a market economy, a mixed economy that we have, it is all predicated on people doing certain things. If people stop spending money, that's bad. Because that's how our economy works. So there's incentives that we're going to talk about today, basically how the government and individual companies and people can encourage people to do certain things, like spend money, and how that behavior is encouraged, or negative incentives, how it's discouraged. Anyway, cool stuff to talk about. Let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be talking about incentives, all about incentives. Incentives. Basically, it's motivation. Incentives is motivation to do something. Now, there's two main types of incentives or motivation in general. The first one is intrinsic incentives. All right. So intrinsic incentives is the same thing as intrinsic motivation, meaning that you do this because you want to. You are self-motivated to do this. Like playing video games. If you like playing video games, you are intrinsically motivated to play video games because that's what you want to do. If you want to hang out with friends, you're intrinsically motivated to hang out with friends because it's somehow rewarding to you. If you like reading for fun, that would be intrinsically motivating. So there's anything that you do because you want to do it, because you choose to do it, that's called intrinsic incentives, because you're basically rewarding yourself by doing it because it's something you automatically want to do. The other one, all right, is extrinsic incentives. Incentives from the outside world. In economics, we're always going to exclusively talk about extrinsic incentives. And when I say almost, we are. It's extrinsic incentives in economics. How do you encourage somebody to have a certain behavior? So if you have me for AP Psychology, we talk a lot about intrinsic incentives and the motivations for the way you do things. In economics, extrinsic incentives. Outside you, like things that people can do to change your behavior and to do things a certain way. So incentives generally in economics are positives, to try to encourage people to do stuff with positive incentives. Generally speaking, positive incentives are much more effective than negative incentives as far as long-term changing of behavior. That's why there's more positive incentives, external incentives being a positive thing, like in this case, money. That would be an external motivating factor is money. So an external incentive would be money. Why do people go to work? All right. You might super love your job. Honestly, don't tell nobody. I would probably do this job for free because I really enjoy it. But they also extrinsically motivate me because they pay me. All right. So if you have a job you don't like but you keep showing up to it every day, why would you do that? Because you're externally being motivated, and that's money. So in economics, money is the prime external motivating factor. So extrinsic incentives in economics is money almost exclusively. So the question here is, explain what incentives are in your own words. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. So there's a handful of incentives that we're going to talk about here today. We're going to start with tax incentives. All right. So tax incentives is basically the government's way of influencing your behavior. A lot of times tax incentives are just called tax benefits, tax breaks. So tax incentives, and we'll talk a lot more about taxes when we get to like personal finance, the second half of this course, where we'll go through about how taxes affect you and how that works. But you pay taxes every year to the government. There are behaviors the government would like you to keep doing or to start doing. All right. To encourage these behaviors, they give an incentive in the form of tax breaks, meaning you don't have to pay as much taxes if you do some of these behaviors. Some of them you might not realize that the government really wants you to participate in. One of the biggest and widely used tax break is the child tax credit. If you have kids under the age of 18, you get money back at tax time. So basically whatever your tax bill is gets cut down a certain amount. If you don't even pay, say it's like $2,000 a child, and you don't owe that much, you can still get extra money back and the government will actually pay you. The reason is the government not only do they support you having kids, because those are future taxpayers, and it's a larger voting block in the future, they also realize that the more the government helps you out, the less reliant you can be on government-funded programs. There's a lot to it, but there is a child tax credit. So if you guys probably, your parents claim you on their taxes and they get a little bit of money every year because you're their kid. And then once you become an adult and move out on your own, parents no longer get that. So it's not a forever thing, but it's while kids are young and still live at home, because the government wants to encourage you to have kids. So the child tax credit is an incentive for kids. Another incentive that the government gives out, a tax credit, is if you're married and you can file jointly. You pay less taxes if you're married and you can file jointly. All right? You pay slightly less taxes than if both people filed individually. Filing means you're paying your taxes at the end of the year. So the government encourages people to get married. All right? This is why gay marriage was such a big deal, because it was basically saying that, from the legal aspect of it, that the government is basically choosing who can marry, and there are like financial benefits to being married, and keeping gay people from being able to be married was discriminatory on the government's part, since they give people incentives to be married, and then they're basically deciding who can or can't be married based on a sexual preference. So, but married filing jointly, that is another tax break that the government gives to married people who file together as like one entity. So your overall tax burden is lower than if you both filed independently. And when I keep saying filing, I mean that you pay your taxes every year. Even if you pay your taxes all year, like taxes come out of my paycheck all the time. You still have to, and if you're not doing it and you have a job, your parents are probably still doing it for you. Every year at the start of the year or before April, between like January and April, you actually have to like fill out a bunch of forms and turn them into the government to validate that you paid the amount of taxes that you need to. You guys, when you pay tax, you probably get money back, because as a full-time student, you basically will get money back. And you have to do it. You'd be in big trouble if you don't. Another tax break is the mortgage interest deduction. When you buy a house, your house payment, so if you buy a house and you take a loan out from a bank to buy the house, all right, you have to pay the bank every month, and then they charge you thank you money called interest. In order to, as you do that every month, and again, it's called a mortgage. The reason it's called a mortgage and not just a house payment, because it's your house and the land, and a lot of times the insurance on the house, all of that stuff is combined into one payment, and that collectively is referred to as a mortgage, but it's your house payment. The interest you pay, the thank you money to the bank that you have to pay back, that can be tax deductible, meaning it lowers the amount of taxes you have to pay at the end of the year. This is trying to encourage people to be homeowners. So the government encourages home ownership by the mortgage interest deduction. Another one, and you guys will probably take advantage of this if you have to take loans out when you go to college, if you go to college. Student loan interest deduction. So you take money out to go to college. When you graduate college, or you go into your skill or whatever it is, and you have to start paying that back, the interest that you have to pay, the thank you money on top of what you have to pay back, it will be tax deductible, and it will lower your tax incentive. This is the government trying to encourage people to go to college and further their education. So student loan interest deduction, that is also an example of a positive incentive. So the question here is, what is a tax incentive? And give an example of why the government would provide such a thing. So why do they give tax incentives for certain things? What are they trying to encourage is basically what this question here is. All right, so pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right, financial incentives. Oh, this is probably the number one incentive in economics, especially in the American mixed economy. It's dangling money in front of you. Financial means money. It's just a money incentive, all right? Like payroll, your salary. If you work at a restaurant, you work at daycare, you work babysitting, you're mowing yards, most of that, unless you're just super loving to do it and you do it for free, the reason you do it is it's a financial incentive. You get paid to do that. So a financial incentive involves getting paid to do something. So the number one incentive is financial incentives. It's to do it to get money. So there's a lot of different ways in which financial incentives are used in our society. The biggest one is your job, you get a paycheck. That's why you show up at a job you might not love, but the financial incentive, like you need money to pay your bills, that is a financial incentive to show up and do it. There are anything like a big sale, buy four, get one free kind of thing. That is an incentive, all right, a financial incentive. Basically, if you buy more, you save money than if you paid full price for all of them. That is a financial incentive. This here behind me is a wanted poster, like $5,000 to turn this guy in, like Billy the Kid. Well, that's a financial incentive to encourage people to turn them in. Whistleblowers. If you work at a corporation in which they're violating all type of federal laws and you turn them in, then you can be compensated depending on the situation as a whistleblower. This encourages people to basically help the federal government enforce laws. Anything that encourages making or saving money would be a financial incentive. All right. So a commission is probably one of the most famous financial incentives. So what a commission is, car salesman, probably the most straightforward one here. A car salesman gets like 2%, I'm making up that number, I have no idea what the percentage is, like 2% of the cost of whatever car they sell. So if they go out and they sell, man, make me have to do math here, come on self. They sell a $50,000 car, 2% of a $50,000 car is going to be $1,000. That would be it. So on top of what their normal pay is, the commission would be $1,000 extra that they make. This is a financial incentive to work really hard and sell a lot of cars so you get more commission from that. So commission is probably one of the most clear examples of a financial incentive because it incentivizes you to be better at your job because like as a car salesman, the more cars you sell, you get more bonuses, more of that commission on top of your existing salary. So a commission is 100% a financial incentive to be the best you possibly can at your job. It'd be also similar to like if you waited tables as a waiter or waitress waiting tables, tips would be a financial incentive as well. So pause me, answer this question here completely, explain how a company giving employees a commission is a financial incentive. Pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right, a subsidy. So a subsidy at first is going to sound like a lot like tax breaks or a tax incentive. It's different, all right? So a subsidy, the official term, is a benefit given to an individual business or institution, usually by the government. So tax incentives, when you pay your taxes, if you have a tax incentive, you just pay less taxes. Or if they owe you more money than you owe them, they will pay you at tax time. Subsidies, all right, is just straight the government giving people money, all right, in order to encourage behavior. And it doesn't happen at tax time. It is the government trying to encourage people to do it. A lot of times subsidies come from state governments more than the federal government, even though the federal government does it on larger scales. So let me give you an example of some subsidies and why they're really, really important in a lot of ways. So one of the most famous ones that might be surprising to you is production incentives for movie companies. And you're like, wait, are you telling me the government gives movie companies tax dollars? Because that's how the government makes money. The government doesn't like have money of their own. Their only money the government has are money given by taxpayers. So the government will give movie companies, and usually state governments, will give movie companies like millions of dollars to encourage them to come film movies in their state. And the movie company's like, thank you for your tax dollars. Now, why would they do that? And you're like, so they're just taking money I paid and giving it to a movie company? They are. But here's why, all right? North Carolina does this very heavily. Georgia has started to do it very heavily. Not surprisingly, California has kind of always done it. But North Carolina in particular, there's a lot of movies now being filmed in North Carolina. And the reason is that North Carolina pays movie companies a whole bunch of money to come film movies here. And you're like, why? Just because so people see how beautiful North Carolina is? Yeah, that has nothing to do with it. It's an economic motivation. Means it's money. And they're like, well, how do they make money if they spend money? Well, it's a big part of economics. You gotta spend money to make money. It's like using capital. So what is happening is, say the North Carolina pays a movie company who's looking for a location $1 million to come film a movie in North Carolina. Well, they were gonna film that movie somewhere, so they're like, $1 million? Absolutely. They come to North Carolina and they film it. You know who they hire? People from North Carolina. You know where they spend money at? In North Carolina. It might be a $300 million movie. They spend tons of money. And guess who gets all the taxes from that $300 million? North Carolina. All the money that gets spent here gets taxed here. So they might have spent $1 million for this movie company, but the government might make back like $15 or $20 million from all the money that movie company spent here. The movie company was going to film it somewhere, so subsidy is just straight giving money to people to try to encourage behavior. Now, the federal government, they give a subsidy, and this is super, super, super important. So America has like the cheapest food on earth. Our food is super cheap. A big reason why that is the United States government subsidizes our farming industry. So the federal government gives money to farmers. The reason this came about is in the late 1800s, farmers were just producing as much as they could, trying to make a bunch of money. Obviously, as everybody does. What ended up happening, and think back to supply and demand, all right, there were so many farmers that had moved out to the middle of the country because the government had given them free land called the Homestead Act. If you had me for U.S. history, that might ring a bell. And everybody started mass producing food. When everybody started mass producing food, guess what happened to supply? It went way up. When supply went way up, way past the equilibrium, what happened to demand? All right, talked about this yesterday. Demand went way down. When demand went way down, the price went way down, and farmers started spending more money to grow their crops than they could sell it for. Almost all the farmers went out of business because they weren't at an equilibrium. Right? They had no idea. They're all independently just growing as much food as they can. Couldn't figure out why, if I'm growing so much food, why am I not making money? I'm growing more food this year than last year and I'm making less money. Because they were farmers. They didn't understand macro level supply and demand. So the federal government stepped in. And the federal government says, all right, we're going to help regulate this by choice. All right? So you can grow everything you want, do whatever you want, or the government will come in and tell you what they would like for you to grow on your crop. So maybe you're growing 100 acres of corn. The government will come in, and we still do this today. Still, we spend millions and millions and millions of dollars, $53 billion in 2020 alone on subsidies overall as a federal government. The government will go to farmers and say you used to grow 100 acres of corn. Well, to keep supply low and keep it at that equilibrium, they only want you to grow 20 acres of corn. The government's like, please only grow 20 acres of corn. And Joe Bob, who's the farmer, he's like, wait a minute, if I only grow 20 acres of corn, I'm not going to make enough money to live. And the government says, here's what we'll do. If you do what we ask you to do and grow 20 acres of corn, the government will pay you as if you grew 100 acres of corn. And farmer's like, so less work, more pay? And the government says, absolutely. So the government does this and creates subsidies for farmers to try to keep supply and demand in unison so that it can stay at that equilibrium point where supply and demand cross. So the government, while it is a choice like, no, I'm growing 100 acres of corn, you're more than welcome to do that. But the government only gives subsidies to farmers who basically agree to play by the rules, which the vast majority of farmers do. So a lot of farmers, the majority of their income is subsidies from the federal government. This allows America to have plenty of food and have very, very cheap food. And we are not, because multiple times in the 1800s, farmers all about put themselves out of business because they were overproducing, which is a unique situation that happened in America. So they were able to stop that by creating subsidies for farmers to regulate supply and demand and keep it at that equilibrium point. So the question here is, explain why it's in everyone's best interest in the United States for the U.S. government to give subsidies to the food industry in America. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So while the vast majority of incentives are positive, all right, there is some negative incentives, all right? So what is a negative incentive? Well, a negative incentive is designed to stop or prevent a behavior, right? Just like a positive incentive is to try to encourage a behavior, negative incentive is trying to stop it. Now, the terminology here is a little weird because the official terminology for a negative incentive, all right, is that basically you have to, there's a lot of times a financial penalty if you don't do what the government wants you to do, but it's not compulsory. All right, what? So there's a really good example, and then there's the example that always gets used in economics and personal finance that I don't know if necessarily matches that description, but I'm going to talk about both of them. All right, so the best example of a negative incentive was absolutely the absolute best example. So there was a thing passed called the Affordable Care Act in 2014. The Affordable Care Act was trying to lower health insurance for everybody. And to do so, they had to make sure everybody bought health insurance because that was it's a whole nother rabbit hole we can go down later on in this course. But they needed everybody to buy health insurance and people weren't all buying it because the idea is everybody bought health insurance, price goes down for everybody. That was the goal. Well, so they passed a law, all right, called the Affordable Care Act. However, they weren't going to like come arrest you and put you in jail if you didn't buy health insurance, all right? So it wasn't illegal to not buy health insurance. So they're like, well, cool, I'm just not gonna buy health insurance. However, there was a very clear negative incentive. If you did not buy health insurance, you got fined every year when you filed your taxes. When you turned your taxes in, you had to pay extra money in taxes if you didn't buy health insurance. All right, that is a negative incentive. It wasn't required by law, meaning you weren't going to prison, all right, if you didn't do it, but there was a negative incentive encouraging you to do it. So that is a true example of a negative incentive. And then the one that always shows up in economics and personal finance is a negative incentive, which I argue with doesn't match the rule. A negative incentive is you getting a ticket for not wearing your seatbelt or speeding. That always shows up as a negative incentive. All right, so if you see that answer, that's always going to be the right answer. I disagree with that just a little bit, purely because it is illegal. The whole point of a negative incentive is trying to encourage people to do something that's not compulsory. It is compulsory to not speed because it's a law. You speed fast enough and you're reckless driving, you can go to jail. So that's just Mr. Wagstaff arguing semantics on that. But according to the world of economics and personal finance, a speeding ticket is an example of a negative incentive because if you get a speeding ticket, and we're just talking normal speeding ticket, you're going 9 miles over the speed limit, and you get pulled over, and the police officer comes up and they give you a ticket. They're not taking you to jail, all right? But you will have to pay a fine, and then your insurance rates go up. That's a negative incentive. People don't want to do that. So for that reason, it would be a negative incentive because there's a financial penalty for not following that rule. So the question here is, explain how a speeding ticket would be considered a negative incentive. All right, so answer that completely. That's what I got for you guys today. See you guys in the next unit.